If you're a Rotary fanatic, chances are you've either seen or heard of Rob Dahm's insane FD RX7. It's a full tube frame build with a quad rotor engine, and to top things off, it's also four-wheel drive. We did shoot this car back in 2019, but a lot's happened since then. We're here with Rob to get a little bit of a catch-up on what's been going on with development of this car. So Rob, back in 2019 when we saw the car, I think it had started and run, but I don't know if it had seen a dyno, so there's a lot to catch up on. Maybe start with that. What happened after SEMA when we saw you last time?
Yeah, so what you saw was the almost first couple hours of the life of the car as a running vehicle. You know, it was a lot of potential, a lot of goal, a lot of ideal, but not a lot of actual. And so this is really the proven version of everything I was claiming or hoping to do. And quite frankly, there's been very few compromises. So it is an absolute animal in many ways. And honestly, not because you're here, but a shameless not self-plug, but you plug, is that because of HP Academy, I took over all the tuning. I took over the engine building. I took over all the wiring, you know, and there's no excuses on this vehicle because I ended up doing it myself. And so it's been a beautiful journey because all the testing and potential that would not be economical for you to pay a tuner to do on a weird vehicle like this, I was able to do, and I've found some really amazing functionality and performance out of this car that, like I said, just deep diving. You know, you get really lost in some specific things, but I'll try and keep it high level first, and then we can dive into whatever we want to dive into.
I should have actually started by saying thank you for propping the HP Academy with your t-shirt. It's a little weird, but I'm going to take it. And I mean, coming back to what you're saying there, I think a lot of enthusiasts watching this would think that doing their own wiring, doing their own tuning is beyond them. And of course, there's a learning curve involved, but I mean, obviously a testament to the fact that you absolutely can if you put your mind to it. Now, as you mentioned there, that was a bit of a test bench. You'd only just got it running. The whole thing is built from the ground up. And I'm interested to know, once you actually got a chance to sort of shake it down, start driving the car, testing it, get it on a dyno, how far from the ballpark was it? Were there any major problems that you found that you weren't aware of until you actually got into testing?
Yeah, so quite a few things that made sense in theory did not work in practicality. So one example is when you looked at the car back then, I had a very complex pathed intercooler. And it was cool. I originally designed it the way it is now, but the company that was helping me said, hey, we can make this a dual pass intercooler because dual pass radiators have benefits, so maybe this will be more beneficial. And it was extremely limiting in terms of airflow at about 1,000 horsepower. So we had a really difficult time making more than 1,000 horsepower, and it wasn't adding up because I didn't have a pre-intercooler sensor, so I didn't know the pressure difference or anything like that. But I ended up doing the math from, you know, intercooling or turbocharging websites on how, you know, like, hey, if this much heat's coming in and coming out, and I was like, I've got a massive pressure drop on my intercooler. So that was one of many examples where another one is my injectors. The intake manifold I bought with this engine, all the injectors were almost a foot away from the engine itself, and so no matter what sort of tuning you tried to do, you could never get the motor under 3,000 RPM to respond without going super lean and then dumping the fuel down into the motor.
There's one of those subtle things that I think until you've actually experienced it, you wouldn't necessarily work out by yourself, but that is why we also see with most production engines that are port injected, the port injectors are very, very close to the intake valve. Obviously this is a rotary, there's no valves, but I'm sure you can get the point. So for that quick introduction of the fuel for transient enrichment. Let's talk a little bit more about the rotary engine. Is this still the original four-rotor that you had in the car back in 2019? Have you found any problems? Has there been any iterations or development there?
So during the interview, all I could think of is that when I was told by the guys that had helped originally assemble the motor, this thing wasn't supposed to last. Like, I was told, like, good luck, and all I cared about was making it into SEMA, knowing I had a running car, and then if it blew up after that, I was good. I did it, you know, like I hit the milestone. And so I was really on the cusp of at least public knowledge of billet rotary engines. I knew that they had ran, I knew PAC and those other guys had things going, but drag cars are a very specific, very quick use of an engine. And so I was really on my own on that point. And so this is still the same engine, but I've actually gotten comfortable enough with machine work to machine injector holes into it. I've done a lot of other work to it, feeding the oil slightly different, a little bit, you know, more I say streamlined process because there were so many hoses and things sticking out of this motor. So
Speaking of machining, just coming back to that, because one of the elements that you told me off camera that you changed was machining the housings to take your injectors, or a stage of injectors, in the factory location. So talk us through that.
Yeah, so like I said, all 16 injectors were about a foot away, and there were quite a few tuners that reached out and said, oh, I can help you. I think your tuning is the problem. And that was the right approach at first, because realistically you would think that, okay, it's an adjustable thing that's causing you problems. But I did the math and I was trying to figure out, okay, how much air would move between each rotor cycle, and I was like, there's just no way that fuel could get to the motor on a transient throttle response. And so I went under the very terrifying process of trying to get the right tolerances to get the injector down into the runner, honestly like OEM. Like I thought, okay, I know OEM works really well, and these injectors are not in that spot. My billet irons were just smooth there. There was nothing there. And so I was like, okay, I have one shot to machine this just right. It's not even a test, it's a production piece. Let me try and machine it smooth enough to be able to seal with an O-ring. I have no room for mistake, because as soon as that O-ring gets too large, it's just the tolerances are very intense. And so
not a part that you want to make a mistake on, right?
Not a part you want to make a mistake on at all. You have no, the motor would have been down for another year or so.
Let's talk a little bit more about the billet components and the rotary engines. As you sort of mentioned, they're definitely not new, but there is still, it's a market that is developing, and from what I've followed, there's been quite a few players in the market, quite a few different approaches. So for a start, for those who aren't rotary fanatics, why are these billet parts necessary in the first place?
Yeah, so Mazda really started something amazing and then understood that wasn't the future, and so they kind of let that sunset a little bit. Now they've gone back into producing replacement parts, but there was a massive amount of time where they weren't. And so people got nervous and they were like, I still want my engine to run. We're going to have to start making things ourselves. And so there were a couple different major approaches. Almost all the billet irons, which are those pieces between the rotor and rotor housings, there were two major ways that people took that on. Either there were like a steel insert that the side of the rotor would sit against, although the seals against that. And then in this case, this is more like the pack performance style, where there was a liquid molten metal of tungsten or chromium carbide sprayed onto the aluminum piece and then ground, flush. And so
let's come back. The reason is because these components are being made out of billet aluminium.
Yes.
And of course, you've got the side seals will run against these, and they're not going to last very long. Just running them directly against the alloy surface is going to wear it out incredibly quickly. So the two approaches, as you say, one is to put a steel insert or a running material in that's harder than the alloy, and the way this one is being done is that spray-on hard coating. I guess not too dissimilar to the NEXUS style lining that some alloy blocks use in the sleeves.
Yep, very, very similar. And so I had rented an X-ray scanner. It was like a $15,000 handheld unit, and it had told me exactly the composition. And so there's got some cobalt, some nickel, and so it was really neat to see. Okay, this is what's working. Like there's an old racing beat housing, and they actually used more of chromium, and it's just a really fascinating thing to start cataloging all the different things that people are doing and seeing what works. Because that's one of the big components of kind of both of our spirits is let's show you what works. And I'm not selling anything, so I can be very unbiased. Like I don't make any money off of it other than just sharing knowledge is where I profit from. So that's the more knowledge, the better, I guess.
Yeah, 100%. We agree wholeheartedly on that front. In terms of cooling, there's a lot of heat being produced in a rotary engine that we need to get rid of. This, as you've already mentioned, it's not a drag engine that's going to run for 6 to 10 seconds at a time. It's longer runs. Yes. I assume that these billet components still have some kind of water jacketing to cope with the heat?
Yeah, so on my billet irons, and I've left them this way for the purpose of experimentation, there are all the water channels. It's still the same jackets, and they run through there, but they're very small holes. And so I'm curious to see, with it being aluminum versus the traditional cast iron, does it allow the heat to transfer to the coolant quicker? I actually put temperature sensors on the inlet and outlet of the motor, because there's a lot of talk about on a 4-rotor, if you have the coolant coming from the front of the motor traditionally, that means that the 4th rotor would get the hottest amount of coolant. So the disparity between rotor 1 and rotor 4 getting different temperatures was a big concern to me. And so I wanted to see how cold the coolant was going in and how hot it was coming out. And I have not yet seen it exceed about 5 to 6 degrees Fahrenheit, even under hard working. So it was a really interesting fact. Okay, here's that. I mean, that is a difference, but it's not as extreme as people were making it sound.
No, I would have definitely assumed a higher differential there. Now, in terms of the four-rotor engines, obviously outside of Le Mans, this isn't an engine you could buy from Mazda. So there's a handful of manufacturers out there who have sort of made the pieces that you need in the aftermarket to produce a four-rotor engine. And I've also seen mixed results in terms of reliability, and a lot of this comes down to supporting of the eccentric shaft. So
yes.
Talk us through what's done here to get the reliability that you're seeing so far.
Yeah, so I've had a very long relationship with Jeff Bruce from Precision Engineering, and he's really kind of the foremost builder or machinist on eccentric shafts. There are a couple other people that I haven't worked with, but his work was the same E-shaft that I originally bought for this car 7 years ago. It's not the E-shaft that's in it right now, it's sitting on my shelf, but it was the one that was infamously lost by UPS. And so that was a four-rotor E-shaft that is a three-piece, which is a traditional, because you can't have it be a one-piece E-shaft because you can't assemble the motor. It just doesn't work that way. So what's really fascinating about this one, and this was sold to me this way, it was not like it was my idea, is that it's a four-piece E-shaft, and there is a bearing in the very center where, if you look at a four-rotor and you just kind of cut the front rotor off and the rear rotor off, actually that center two are very much like a two-rotor. They've got that big knot in the middle between the two rotors, and then they're at 180 degrees of each other. They should be 1-3. No, they're not. But the point is there's a huge knot between the two. And so in this motor, that does not exist. That the rotor pops off, and there's another bearing in that very center. That is a ball bearing, not a journal bearing. But just like my front cover, and many people use a front cover ball bearing. So I have two ball bearings in the front and the center of the motor. And I think that is a major improvement, especially for a longer E-shaft, that center isn't flexing, that every section between a rotor is supported.
I mean, most people would think that when you see one of these eccentric shafts sitting there on the workbench, I mean, they're nice and rigid, nice and stiff. You couldn't imagine that they're going to flex too much, but particularly at 8,000 plus RPM and with maybe 1,200 plus wheel horsepower on board, it's going to be surprising to most just how much those will move around. And if you don't have that eccentric shaft supported, I imagine the knock-on effect there is that the rotors aren't going to run true in the housing, so you can have problems with the rotors contacting as well.
Yes, so that as well, I mean, that is the theme of what I've been trying to find, testing different things that people talk about making a rotary reliable. One of the biggest things I'm a proponent of is strengthening that basically torsional rigidity of the motor. So, it's a bunch of plates in a row, and so you have the E-shaft that needs to be supported better, but I think that the motor itself, you've got these very thin tension bolts. And they're functional. They work great for stock horsepower levels. But I'm a big fan of bigger studs, but more so dowels. And so it's economical because I have a CNC machine, but I have this traditional 16 millimeter dowel. I have 7 or 8 of those in all of my motors going straight through. Now they are actually studs, so they're dowels with screws on the ends. But I can tell you firsthand on the four rotor when I raced Ken Block. I had turned the boost all the way up to about 40. There was 39 PSI. So the fuel usage and the air to fuel ratio suggests it was well over 1,500 horsepower when I was racing him. That's hypothetical. But I had either like a rich misfire or something occurred, and my second rotor had an event. Well, the motor, when I tore it down, I took a stone, like a clearancing stone, and my aluminum housing, the Mazda housing, had a small indent, a small raise on where the combustion chamber was because something bad happened. But it had the dowel directly behind it had caught it, and then it had raised up the aluminum, so it had pressed against the dowel so hard that it had deformed the aluminum slightly. But the motor was still perfect, perfect compression, all of that. Well, not perfect for me.
Still running.
And so it has shown that dowel had kept that motor from expanding to a very catastrophic level.
I think the other thing that's easy to overlook is the torsional forces that are involved with launching a car and that seems to have, just from my experience in the drag racing realm, it seems to have a problem with some of these engines, particularly four rotors. They tend to twist and then bad stuff happens. So I think anything you can do there in order to increase the torsional rigidity of the engine's got to be a good thing. I'm interested just to talk a little bit about the porting on this engine. I mean, there's a variety of different options. There's the side port, full peripheral port, semi-PP, and then with the side ports, there's obviously extend ports, bridge ports. Everyone's got their own naming sort of strategy for the ports as well, and each of them have their pros and cons. So for a start, what are you running on this engine?
So this motor came to me with basically what extend or street port, and it's closer to the size of the Cosmo port, which I'm very familiar with on the 3-rotor, and I've got semi-Ps on some of my other cars that I'm testing, but this is actually just a very traditional expanded or extended port, side port on both the primary and secondary sides of the motor. So there's not anything coming in directly peripherally to this motor.
So pros and cons of this extend port style of porting and retaining the side ports versus going to a full peripheral port or a semi-PP. And I mean, maybe if you could just give a high-level view of what a peripheral port is for those who maybe haven't seen one.
Yeah, so when peripheral port is almost like where you have the exhaust that comes directly out the face of the rotor, the side of the rotor. You do the same thing with the intake. And so that's full peripheral. And it's funny to me because I never really realized that semi-peripheral didn't mean that it's a smaller peripheral port. It just means that it's also peripheral ported as well as side ported. And so I've been experimenting a lot with semi-peripheral. I have not had a motor yet that's full peripheral because I want low-end streetability, and I've always tried to do the most with the least. And so that's been my approach. And so semi-P has been my fascination. This motor would have an insane number of intake runners to have semi-P, so I've avoided that with this one. But I noticed something that's very interesting is that certain apex seals, and I made a video going through all different ones and that I've scanned all of them. I'm currently testing all different apex seals and seeing what the benefit of the softer ones are, what the benefit of the harder ones are. And one of the things I've noticed is that on a side port motor, when you push it very hard, soft or very specific types of apex seals will warp in the center. And so I took those same exact seals that came out of this motor that had warped, took the rest that were good, put them into my 3-rotor, and I beat the crap out of that engine. Like per rotor, I make more power on that motor at more moments than this motor, and it has maintained phenomenal compression, but I think it's the semi-P cooling the center of that apex seal. So I'm playing with some theories right now, but I'd love to keep the public aware of what I'm doing.
It's interesting. I wanted to dive into the apex seals discussion next, so that's a nice segue. The apex seal, obviously, again, for those who aren't familiar with rotaries, that is on, as its name suggests, the apex of the rotor. You've got 3 of them per rotor housing, and that will seal against the rotor housing. So really key for getting good compression and keeping the combustion event where it should be. So there's the factory seals, there's 2mm versus 3mm, then there's a huge number of aftermarket players to the market. Now, I don't have a huge amount of personal experience building these engines, but I do deal with a lot of people who do. And what I hear is that there's definitely compromises with some of these aftermarket seals where the strength is there, they won't physically break. Maybe they will warp, as you're talking about,
yep.
But they won't break, which is important for not destroying the rest of the engine. But the downside is some of these also come with huge wear where they're actually rubbing or wearing against the rotor housing. So what have you found there?
Yeah, so I rented an X-ray scanner. This really cool XRF scanner, and I have at least 10 of all the variety of apex seals out there. And so I scanned all of them. I cleaned them off, ground it down so that way I knew I was getting the metal of the apex seal. And I scanned all of them, and I have this big database of what materials each of these are made of. And I realized that is a small fraction of the puzzle of apex seals, is that it's really the heat treating of how long they are heat treated, which increases their brittleness or strength, however you want to word that. And so you tend to find out that the high methanol, insane drag racing seals tend to be heat treated longer. That's kind of their secret or their trick. So they can actually be almost the same metal, but heat treated for an extra 12 hours. And so it's really fascinating finding that sort of information out. And so I'm not a drag racer, but I do have bursts of utilizing that power like that. And so I've been focusing a little bit more on variety of use. And so again, I'm building up a database because that's such a controversial question. Everybody asks me, what apex seals do you use? And the honest answer is I use a lot of different ones because I'm trying to see trends. And
I think on that note as well, everyone has their sort of their pet favourite, so it does always get to be a bit of a controversial debate. I mean, I think it's going to be very hard to get a clear 100% defined winner in terms of apex seals, what's the best, because the question that goes along with that is the best for what? As you mentioned, what will be ideal for a drag racing application, 6 or 7 seconds of full power versus driving around road race applications, very, very different, correct?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And that's what I learned very quickly, is that it was the best for what? What are you trying to do? And that's a little overwhelming to a beginner, a person getting into rotary engines. The question is, or they hear and see all of the memes that the apex seal is the problem, apex seal, boost in, apex seals out. But so then the right question is, well, then what's the right apex seals? And I hate when it's a loaded question that, well, for what? Now, I do like to see the softer ones, like you said briefly earlier, is that the stock apex seals are phenomenal. They really are, but they're brittle. And I took a stock motor in my rotary Corvette to prove a point, counterproductive, but to prove the point that it could make more torque than the naturally aspirated LS that people swap in. And I was able to accomplish that. Stock block, no modifications, but I ended up snapping a stock apex seal, and it just took out that whole part of the motor. And so I learned my limits, but aftermarket tends to be softer, and so they warp. So it's more of like a safety feature, not necessarily a performance feature.
Yeah, they warp, you essentially lose compression, so the engine won't start, you're forced to tear it down and do something, but the key part there is that the apex seal has stayed intact, hasn't taken out your housing, it hasn't taken out your rotor, and then made its way out through your turbocharger as well, which gets to be a bit of an expensive train wreck in general.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so moving on from the apex seals, let's talk a little bit about the engine management. And you have gone through a change here, so I'm interested to sort of talk about that. What did you have and why have you changed?
Yes, so people that follow my channel very closely know that I am a fan of using a lot of different things because it fortifies my knowledge on even the specific things, because people do it differently, and you see strategies that different ECUs, they name them different, or they approach things differently, especially transient throttle. That is a very different thing for different ECUs. And so this car started with an Adaptronic, and this car exists because of Adaptronic. They were a huge supporter and very, very much enabled me to know that things were possible. And so with that, Adaptronic really tended to be more of a beta test. There were a lot of functionality that was very promising that made it easy to tune, but the advanced functions were a little rough. And so I'm actually very thankful that Haltech bought Adaptronic and then took the brainchild of Adaptronic, Andy Wyatt, and then let him work within their polished environment, and the NEXUS series was created. And so I moved from the Adaptronic M6000 to the Haltech R5. It was funny because Haltech actually sponsored me with that, but it was for a different project, but I really saw all the functionality that ECU had, ECU and power distribution module kind of all in one. And so I put it in this car instead, and oh my God, that was so worth it. They had recently, I did this whole strategy because this is an all-wheel drive car, and so it's from an R32 GTR, and I had worked very hard to reverse engineer that. Well, maybe a month after I got the car running on the R5, they released an ATTESA control system. So it's phenomenal for dynamic, the all-wheel drive system on this car right now. I can either go full rear-wheel drive, full all-wheel drive, or even a shade of based on lateral and longitudinal G-force, pedal position, engine demand, all of these different in custom parameters, and it dynamically adjusts the all-wheel drive.
So that's an aftermarket controller for the factory Nissan ATTESA system?
It's built, yes. So the stock system, when they say ATTESA, is not just at the end of the day, the all-wheel drive system on the ATTESA is really just like if you had a fourth pedal you could actually have a fourth pedal that just like a clutch pedal that would be rear-wheel drive to all-wheel drive, and that's all that's going on. So there's an electronic system controlling that fourth pedal is the way I like to look at it, simplify it, and then go, okay, so now the Haltech controls the electronic system that's just going no pressure to full pressure and every shade in between.
And a lot of the drag racing people running the R32 GTR, or any of those earlier GTRs for that matter, tend to sort of launch in full four-wheel drive, and then once the car's sort of out of the hole, maybe past the 330, they'll actually start removing that front drive component because it becomes less necessary. Are you doing anything similar to that?
Somewhat similar, is that when I launched this car on the street, or when you saw me race Ken Block, I was at about 30% torque to the front, and I don't know the exact parameters of what that means. I haven't tested when does the front start to break loose or no longer provide traction. When does it start to slip? I don't know that answer, but at least from a general perspective, I'd seen that a lot of R32 will just either they'll do exactly what you said, or they'll stay at about 30% to the front and launch it on that way. And so that's what I had done then. It is a very violent car when I lock it in all-wheel drive, and this car was based off of the Unicorn suspension, and so I wanted to do Unicorn things, and so when I locked it into full all-wheel drive, drifting this thing really showed that the system is locking those front tires very solidly, because I'm always on very fresh, sticky tires when I'm doing something stupid like that, and so it's neat to see that the all-wheel drive system is just working so flawlessly.
Let's just come back to the Haltech NEXUS R5 for a moment. As you mentioned, Andy Wyatt, who was at Apptronic, he sort of now is Haltech, and he was instrumental in the R5. And to your point about the Apptronic, I tend to agree, having had my own experiences with them. One of the really nice features, which I think of all of the brands I've tuned, is the most seamless, is their staged injection.
Yes.
It requires very little input from the tuner, and literally you just don't notice the crossover. Nice thing, of course, is now that is available on the NEXUS R5, or the Haltech brand. In terms of that R5, for people who aren't aware of it, could you tell us what is unique about the R5?
Yeah, absolutely. So, my experience of ECUs is all Apptronic, Fuel Tech, and Haltech, and those are very consumer-friendly brands. You've got the high-level stuff, and so I feel like the R5 is a beautiful crossover into very professional ECUs. It has so much customization that not only can you do the basics, but you can start to feel comfortable doing custom things, and I think that's where it really shines for me. But some of the major benefits of the R5 is the logging system. The Elite 2500 has a very small logging internal storage. The R5 basically logged the last year of my life. It's a lot of database, and management by measurement is a very big part of the philosophy.
I think a lot of people might not see the value in that, but particularly when you're starting to try and fine-tune what is a very complex vehicle, you are relying on looking at the data after you've been out on the drag strip or around the track, so that's pretty important. The other element that I really liked about the R5 is the integration of essentially a power distribution module, so you're utilizing that as well?
Yes, this car is running off of the R5, and it's maxed out, inputs and outputs. Not power out, all inputs, all power outputs, not all of the data outputs, because I don't need all 20 million injectors. I need a lot of injectors, just not all of those. And then I also have the ECU Masters PDU, I think.
PMU, I think.
Yeah, PMU, yeah. Everybody has a different acronym. The Autosport version of their PMU, love that as well. And it actually has the dash from ECU Masters as well, and with phenomenal 16-point wheel speed or wheel temperature sensors. So I can see a video game, I can see the temperature of the tire in 16 points. So both of those companies have worked really well on this car, and it actually works from a power distribution center standpoint. My ignition system, which is actually from a Fuel Tech, it's their FTSpark. Rotary requires two separate capacitor units because you have the leading and the trailing firing so quick that the capacitor can't recharge. So at full tilt, this car uses 80 amps on ignition only. And so it's a little overkill, I believe, but I've never had a problem with it. And so you can see my need for power on this car is pretty great. So having both the ECU Masters and the R5, wonderful combination.
How have you gone about spreading the load across those two units? Have you sort of focused on the R5 for engine-based power requirements, and then the PMU 16, or sorry, the Autosport version of the PMU for the rest of the chassis wiring, or a combination?
I definitely tried to do that because I wanted to make sure, if kind of thinking about fail-safes, that if this unit was to disconnect or if something on that unit was to overload the entire unit, would I have some of my engine break and then therefore take out my motor? And so I made sure all the super critical things were on the Adaptronic. I made sure that all the super critical things were on the R5. So that way, if things were to fail, at least I would have the heart of this motor. And that's something I really just want to say very quickly, is that I think the biggest mistake on rotary engines is that people forget that the engine is just very, very sensitive. They call it unreliable. I think of it as sensitive. And so all the other systems, your fuel system, your ignition system, your cooling system, that's actually the rotary engine problem. And so that's when I was thinking about how to build the electronic system. I went with brushless fuel pumps. I went with a water pump that was from a BMW, and that's also brushless. But and so I could cycle the coolant, while the car's off. And so I did a lot to support the vehicle. And again, that was my strategy while wiring the car.
Yeah, I think this really comes back to your point about running the Corvette engine with the stock seals. And I mean, I think in general, rotary engines get a bad rap. They've got a bad reputation for reliability, which isn't entirely justified. I think most of the issues around rotary engines and failures is either they've been built incorrectly with the wrong parts, or more often they're tuned incorrectly. As you mentioned, they are a very sensitive engine. You could run most inline 6-cylinder engines, piston engines, into light detonation while you're sort of sorting things out and maybe finding the limits. Try doing that on a rotary engine, and it's probably not going to end well for you. So I think, tuned sensibly with a nice conservative approach, they 100% can be reliable. Yeah. Look, Rob, I know we could talk for another hour here today, but I do want to respect your time. You're a man in demand, so we'll wrap it up there. Yeah. Thanks so much for your time, and we look forward to seeing the rest of this journey. If people do want to see more of the car, and I know you've got an unlimited amount of content on it, where are they best to do so? Yeah, so I'm very creative, and everything is just my first and last name, Rob Dahm. So like YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, it's all ROBDAHM. We'll chuck a link in the description as well, so it makes it super easy. Thanks again for your time. Thank you for making my tuning and wiring possible.
If you like that video, make sure you give it a thumbs up. And if you're not already a subscriber, make sure you're subscribed. We release a new video every week. And if you like free stuff, we've got a great deal for you. Click the link in the description to claim your free spot to our next live lesson.